This is the unknown zone, where hidden stories of history finally speak. Tonight, we enter the heart of Nazi Germany, a place where loyalty was law and doubt was death. Yet inside Hitler's own army, a handful of men dared to dream of justice. They plotted the impossible, to kill the Führer himself. This is the story of Operation Valkyrie. Germany, 1944. The Third Reich was beginning to crack, though few inside dared admit it. The war that had once promised triumph now reeked of exhaustion and despair. Cities lay in ruins from Allied bombs. Millions were dead. The Eastern Front bled daily against the relentless push of the Soviet army. And yet, inside Hitler's headquarters, the illusion of victory still ruled. Adolf Hitler had become untouchable, a man worshipped as destiny itself. But among the officers of the Wehrmacht, belief was fading. They had sworn an oath to him personally, yet many now saw what he truly was, a destroyer of their nation, dragging Germany into ruin. For some, that realization became unbearable. They began to whisper treason, not out of hatred for Germany, but out of love for it. Among them was Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, an aristocrat, a soldier, and a patriot. He had once believed in Hitler's vision of renewal. But years of slaughter, the crimes in the East, and the collapse of honor within the army changed him. He had lost an eye, a hand, and 2 fingers in North Africa. Yet he returned from war, determined to fight again, this time against the regime itself. By 1943, resistance inside Germany had taken shape. It was not a popular uprising or a crowd in the streets. It was a quiet network of officers, diplomats, priests, and scholars. Men like General Ludwig Beck, once chief of the General Staff, Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, and General Henning von Treschow, the moral heart of the movement. They called themselves simply the Resistance. Their goal, remove Hitler and negotiate peace before Germany was completely destroyed. But how could anyone kill a dictator protected by fear itself? Hitler's schedule was secret. His guards were loyal fanatics. Every visitor was searched, every meal tasted. Assassination attempts had already failed. Bombs that didn't detonate, snipers who couldn't get close. Then came the idea that would change everything. Use Hitler's own defense plan against him. Operation Valkyrie was originally designed as an emergency order. Its purpose was simple. If Allied bombers destroyed Berlin, or if civil unrest broke out, the German Army Reserve could seize control to restore order. The plan was legal, detailed, and signed by Hitler himself. The conspirators realized they could use it as a weapon. If they could kill Hitler and activate Valkyrie, they could seize the government in his name. Before anyone discovered he was dead, within hours, they could arrest the SS, occupy communication centers, and restore military rule under their command. It was a coup disguised as obedience. General Beck would become head of state, Goerdeler would serve as chancellor, and Claus von Stauffenberg, the wounded officer with burning eyes and a calm voice, would deliver the bomb. By early 1944, the war had turned against Germany. The conspirators felt time slipping away. Stauffenberg joined the General Army Office in Berlin, a position that gave him access to Hitler's briefings. For the first time, they had a man inside the circle. He carried his wounds like symbols. One eye hidden behind a patch, his right hand gone, his left barely usable. Yet he radiated confidence. He was the kind of man others followed without question. When he spoke of Germany's future, even the cautious began to hope. The plan was simple in concept, impossible in practice. He would attend a staff meeting at Hitler's headquarters, the Wolfschanze, or Wolf's Lair, in East Prussia. He would bring a briefcase filled with explosives, set the timer, and leave the room. When the bomb exploded, Hitler and his closest aides would be killed instantly. At that moment, the conspirators in Berlin would launch Operation Valkyrie, using official army channels to seize power. If everything went perfectly, the war could end within days. If it failed, they would all die. For months, the resistance prepared in secret. They tested explosives, rewrote the Valkyrie orders, and built a communications network inside the army. Each step brought new danger. Gestapo informants were everywhere, and betrayal was a constant threat. But still, they moved forward, not out of hope for survival, but out of duty. General Treskov once said, "The attempt must be made, even if it fails. The moral value of this action will justify itself before history." It became the creed of them all. On July 15, 1944, Stauffenberg carried the bomb to the Wolf's Lair for the first time. Everything was ready. But just before he could arm it, word came that Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, key figures in the Nazi hierarchy, were not present. Without their deaths, the coup would be incomplete. Reluctantly, Stauffenberg withdrew. The plan was postponed. He returned to Berlin furious, convinced that hesitation would doom them all. Each day the war dragged on. Thousands more died. Cities burned, civilians starved, soldiers froze on the Eastern Front. He told his co-conspirators, now it must happen, no matter what. 5 days later, he got his chance. On the morning of July 20th, 1944, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg boarded a plane bound for East Prussia. He carried with him a briefcase, a detonator pencil, and Germany's last hope. Morning, July 20th, 1944. The air over East Prussia was heavy with summer heat. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg sat silently on the small transport plane that carried him toward the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's command center. The rhythmic hum of the engines filled the cabin. Inside his briefcase was a bomb that could end the war, or end his life. He wore his uniform impeccably, every detail perfect. To anyone watching, he was the model of loyalty, a wounded hero summoned by the Führer himself to report on the reorganization of the reserve army. No one suspected that beneath his calm demeanor, he carried the weight of history. As the plane descended through the mist, the vast pine forests of East Prussia stretched below, concealing the most heavily guarded headquarters in Europe. The Wolf's Lair was surrounded by barbed wire, bunkers, landmines, and guard towers. Nearly 2,000 men guarded Hitler's life. No one had ever come close to killing him here. Stauffenberg stepped onto the tarmac and was met by Colonel Heinz Brandt, one of Hitler's aides. He smiled politely, his briefcase in hand. The two men entered a car that wound through the dense forest toward the main compound. At 10 a.m., the heat was already stifling. Inside the Wolf's Lair, the meeting location had been changed. Instead of the usual reinforced concrete bunker, the conference would be held in a lighter wooden hut, a simple meeting room with windows open for ventilation. To the conspirators, that change would be disastrous. The bomb they had prepared was designed to create pressure and shrapnel in an enclosed space. In an open room, much of its power would escape. But there was no turning back. The plan had already begun. Stauffenberg was escorted through security. He passed armed guards, SS officers, and rows of communications equipment. Every move was watched, every item inspected. but his reputation. The wounded hero, the loyal colonel, shielded him. The guards allowed his briefcase through with only a cursory glance. He was taken to a small anteroom and offered a drink of water. He declined. Every second mattered. He needed to arm the bomb. Inside the briefcase were 2 British-made plastic explosives and a pencil detonator, a device that, once snapped, would ignite a fuse after 10 to 15 minutes. With only one usable hand, it was nearly impossible to prepare. He asked to be shown to a private room where he could freshen up before meeting the Führer. Once alone, he set the briefcase on a table, pulled out the detonator, and snapped it against the edge of the desk. The ticking began. He could arm only one of the 2 charges. His damaged fingers made it too difficult to prepare the second. Time was running out. He closed the briefcase, locked it, and rejoined the officers outside. At 12:30 p.m., the meeting began. Hitler entered the room surrounded by his staff, Field Marshal Keitel, General Jodl, and others. He appeared pale and tense, his movements stiff from illness and exhaustion. The war was collapsing, but he refused to see it. As he began speaking, Stauffenberg placed the briefcase under the table, close to Hitler's position, and stepped back, pretending to review documents. He whispered to Brandt that he needed to make a quick phone call and excused himself. He walked briskly out of the room, his heart pounding, every step echoing in his ears. Outside, he adjusted his cap and moved toward the car waiting nearby. He had done it. Inside the conference hut, the ticking continued beneath the oak table. No one noticed. At exactly 12:42 p.m., a sudden blast shattered the stillness. The wooden hut erupted in flame and smoke. Windows blew out, walls splintered, and men were thrown to the ground. The explosion ripped through the air, echoing across the compound. Screams followed. Inside, chaos. Bodies lay scattered, uniforms torn, dust and debris filling the room. For a moment, it seemed impossible that anyone could have survived. Reports later described the blast as deafening. The table itself had absorbed much of the force, shielding those on the far side. One man was killed instantly. Several others were critically injured, but Adolf Hitler was alive. By a twist of fate and physics, the heavy oak table leg had blocked the explosion. The briefcase had been moved moments before the blast, accidentally kicked aside by Colonel Brandt. That single motion had saved Hitler's life. Outside, Stauffenberg heard the explosion. He didn't wait to confirm the result. He ran toward the car, shouting to his driver, "The Führer is dead!" They sped toward the airfield as sirens wailed behind them. The plan depended on speed. He had to reach Berlin before news spread. The drive was frantic. He tore off his cap, drenched in sweat, rehearsing the next step in his mind. Once back in the capital, the conspirators would activate Operation Valkyrie, seize control of the government, the radio stations, the ministries, and the SS headquarters. The success of the coup depended on a single assumption, that Hitler was dead. At 1:30 p.m., Stauffenberg's plane took off. He looked out the window at the receding forest below. He believed he had done it. Germany's nightmare was over. But at that same moment, deep inside the shattered conference hut, a stunned and furious Hitler was being pulled from the wreckage. His uniform torn, his eardrums ruptured, his right arm burned, but alive and vengeful. Within minutes, the machinery of the Nazi state roared into action. The radio lines buzzed, and the SS's began spreading the message. An attempt has been made on the Führer's life. He has survived. In Berlin, the conspirators waited anxiously. Stauffenberg landed at 3 p.m. and rushed to the Bendler block, the Reserve Army headquarters. He burst into the room shouting, "Hitler is dead! The bomb exploded right next to him." For a brief moment, the room erupted in relief and disbelief. It was happening. After years of fear and silence, they had done it. General Friedrich Olbricht immediately began implementing Valkyrie. Troops were mobilized, communications seized, and orders sent across Germany to arrest key Nazi leaders. Berlin's government quarter fell under their control. For 2 hours, it seemed the coup had succeeded. But soon, cracks appeared. Reports began arriving that Hitler might still be alive. No one could confirm it. The lines of communication were chaotic, rumors everywhere. Stauffenberg refused to believe it. He insisted that the Führer was dead, that the SS was spreading lies to sow confusion. He was confident, defiant, unstoppable. But at 6 p.m., the truth broke through. Hitler had spoken. His voice, unmistakable, shaking with rage, had been broadcast over the radio. He was alive, and he wanted revenge. Inside the Bendler block, panic spread. Officers who had sworn loyalty to the conspirators began hesitating. Some slipped away. Others turned their guns on their former allies. Within hours, loyalist forces surrounded the building. Gunfire echoed through the corridors of Berlin. By midnight, it was over. The coup had collapsed. The dream of a free Germany had died in the dark. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, General Olbricht, and their comrades were arrested on the spot. At 12:30 a.m., July 21st, 1944, they were led into the courtyard of the Bendler block. Under the pale moonlight, without trial or mercy, they were executed by firing squad. Stauffenberg's last words were clear and unwavering. "Long live sacred Germany." Midnight had passed, and Berlin had fallen silent again. The brief roar of rebellion was over. By dawn, the city's heartbeat was back under Nazi control. Inside the Bendler block courtyard, the cold July air carried the echo of gunfire. 4 men lay dead: Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, General Friedrich Olbricht, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and Lieutenant Werner von Heften. They had been executed by their own soldiers, under orders from loyal officers. No trial, no last rites, only a few whispered words before the shots. Their bodies were left on the ground for hours as a warning. By morning, Gestapo trucks arrived. The cleanup began, not of bodies, but of evidence. The Nazi state was preparing its revenge. News of the assassination attempt spread across Germany within hours. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels seized control of the narrative immediately. He framed the conspirators not as patriots or moral men, but as traitors, cowards who had stabbed their nation in the back. On every radio, in every newspaper, the same message repeated: the Führer lives by the mercy of Providence. Hitler's survival was presented as a miracle, proof of divine protection. In truth, it was luck, coincidence, and the thickness of an oak table leg. But in a country drowning in fear, even miracles could be manufactured. That night, Hitler appeared on national radio for the first time since the explosion. His voice was hoarse, furious, trembling with a mix of rage and triumph. He declared, "This time, the criminals will not escape their punishment. The German people will know that Providence has chosen me to continue the mission." For the conspirators, those words were a death sentence. Within hours, the Gestapo, led by Heinrich Müller, launched one of the most ruthless manhunts in modern history. Every name connected to the resistance, every whisper of disloyalty was pursued. Documents seized from the conspirators' offices revealed names, notes, and partial lists of sympathizers. Even the most remote suspects were dragged in for interrogation. Over 7,000 people were arrested in the following weeks. Nearly 5,000 were executed. Among them were some of Germany's most respected officers and thinkers, men who had served their country for decades. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who had been chosen to command the new government, was hanged in August. General Ludwig Beck, one of the movement's founders, was forced to take his own life inside the Bendler block. Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, was executed in February 1945 after months of torture. Henning von Treschow, whose moral conviction had inspired so many, took a grenade to his chest on the Eastern Front, saying, "A man must act, even if he knows it will cost him everything." The trials that followed were not trials at all. They were spectacles of humiliation. The Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, was presided over by Roland Freisler, a screaming fanatic who turned every hearing into theater. The accused stood in rags, their belts removed so their pants would fall as they faced the camera. They were mocked, cursed, and sentenced to death before they could speak. Most were hanged with piano wire, slow, brutal, and filmed for Hitler's private viewing. The recordings were later destroyed, but survivors who saw them said Hitler watched them repeatedly, taking pleasure in their deaths. For him, Valkyrie was proof that treachery lived even within his own army. He became more paranoid, more isolated, more consumed by vengeance. In his mind, the failed coup justified everything that came after. Every execution, every act of cruelty, every descent into madness. But even as the Nazi state tightened its grip, the seed planted by Valkyrie began to grow in silence. Not all Germans believed the propaganda. Whispers spread quietly that there had been men who had tried to stop Hitler, men who had risked everything. For the first time in years, hope took a new form. Not victory, but conscience. Outside Germany, the world watched with mixed emotions. Allied leaders were aware of the coup, but had never believed it would succeed. Still, when the truth emerged, that German officers had tried to kill Hitler, it changed how the world saw the German people. It proved that inside the machine of tyranny, humanity had not completely died. The conspirators' failure did not end the war. Germany fought on for 9 more brutal months. But it ended the myth of unanimous loyalty. It exposed the cracks in the Nazi regime's armor, cracks that would widen until the Reich itself collapsed. In the final months of the war, as Berlin burned and Hitler hid in his bunker, many soldiers remembered the men of Valkyrie. They whispered their names like a forbidden prayer. Stauffenberg, Beck, Treschow. Men who had stood up when no one else dared. Men who had died believing that one act of courage could redeem a nation drowning in guilt. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, and the world saw the full horror of the concentration camps, the meaning of Valkyrie changed forever. It was no longer just a failed coup. It was proof that at least some had tried to stop it. After the war, the names of the conspirators were buried under silence. Germany, shattered and occupied, struggled with the question of guilt. The victors held trials at Nuremberg for the architects of war. But for the men of Valkyrie, there were no honors, no monuments. For years, they were viewed with suspicion, traitors to some, heroes to others. The wounds were too fresh, the memories too heavy. It would take decades for the country to face the truth. In the 1950s and 60s, as West Germany rebuilt, young historians began to revisit the documents. They found letters, diaries, and recordings that revealed the depth of the resistance. Slowly, the story began to shift. Claus von Stauffenberg was no longer the traitor who betrayed his oath. He became the symbol of a different Germany, one that refused to obey blindly. By the 1990s, the July 20th conspirators were officially honored by the German government as national heroes. Their memorial now stands at the Bendler Block courtyard, the place where they died. Every year on July 20th, German officers lay wreaths there in silence. Their oath is no longer to a leader, but to the Constitution. But their legacy goes beyond Germany. Operation Valkyrie remains one of history's most powerful lessons, that morality and loyalty are not the same. That obedience, when it serves evil, becomes guilt, and that even in a world consumed by terror, a handful of people can still choose conscience over comfort. The plot failed. Hitler lived for 9 more months, but the men of Valkyrie proved something eternal. That courage isn't measured by success, but by the willingness to act when everyone else stays silent. They stood against a regime of fear, knowing they would die. And in their death, they gave the world proof that even under tyranny, there were still men who believed in honor. Their story is not one of failure. It's one of defiance, of a nation's conscience trying one last time to save its soul. The gunshots that echoed through the Bendler Block courtyard on July 21st, 1944, were meant to erase a rebellion, but instead they planted a question that still echoes through history. When obedience becomes evil, what does honor demand? For decades, Germany wrestled with that question. The men of Operation Valkyrie were not saints. They were officers of Hitler's army, men who had once sworn loyalty to the very system they tried to destroy. Some had served on the front lines of conquest. Others had looked away from atrocities too long. Their rebellion came late, but it came. And in that moment, it redefined what courage meant. In the ruins of post-war Germany, their story was uncomfortable. The country was shattered, divided between East and West, haunted by guilt and denial. Most people wanted to forget the past, not confront it. The conspirators' names were whispered, but rarely honored. In East Germany, the Soviet-backed government dismissed them as bourgeois traitors. In the West, many saw them as opportunists who had acted only when Germany was losing the war. For a long time, their sacrifice found no place in the nation's recovery. But time has a way of uncovering truth. As the world began to understand the full scale of Nazi crimes, the death camps, the massacres, the totalitarian machinery, the meaning of Valkyrie changed. It was no longer about military rebellion. It was about morality in an age of blindness. Historians began to re-examine their motives, uncovering letters and diaries that revealed not ambition, but conscience. Henning von Trescow's final words became a kind of moral testament for a broken nation. The moral value of a man begins when he is ready to give his life for what is right. Slowly, the story of Valkyrie became a mirror through which Germany could begin to see itself, not as a nation of monsters, but as a nation capable of redemption. The men who died trying to kill Hitler became symbols of another Germany, one that had existed in secret, suppressed by fear, but never entirely gone. By the 1950s, the new Bundeswehr, West Germany's reformed military, made a deliberate decision. Its soldiers would no longer swear loyalty to a person, but to the Constitution and to the principles of justice. That change was inspired directly by Valkyrie. It was an act of moral repair, a promise that blind obedience would never again replace conscience. In classrooms, memorials, and history books, Valkyrie began to appear not as treason, but as a form of courage. Young Germans learned that resistance could exist even in the heart of tyranny, that even in a nation consumed by propaganda, there had been those who saw through the lies, that patriotism was not obedience. It was the courage to protect one's country from itself. Still, the legacy of Valkyrie remained complex. Not all of the conspirators had clean hands. Some were conservative officers who sought to preserve Germany's honor more than to end its crimes. Few spoke out about the Holocaust. They wanted to end Hitler's madness, yes, but they were still products of their time. Their courage was real, but it was human, flawed, conflicted. And perhaps that is what makes it powerful. History rarely gives us perfect heroes. It gives us imperfect men who, for one moment, choose the right thing, despite everything. That moment, more than anything, defines Operation Valkyrie. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the plot, German President Richard von Weizsäcker, himself a wartime officer, stood in the Bendler Block courtyard and said, "Those who acted on July 20th recognized the truth and took responsibility. They represent the best of our history, not its betrayal." His words marked a turning point. For the first time, the state officially honored the conspirators as national heroes. Monuments followed. The Bendler Block became a memorial. The Gedenkstätte Deutscher Widerstand, the German Resistance Museum. Inside, the walls bear the faces of hundreds who stood against the regime, officers, students, pastors, workers, and even children. It is not a monument to victory. It is a monument to conscience. Every year, on July 20th, soldiers of the Bundeswehr gather there. They take their oaths of service not under the shadow of Hitler, but in the memory of Stauffenberg. Their oath is no longer personal, it is moral. To uphold justice, even against authority. To act, even when obedience is easier. To remember that the greatest loyalty is to what is right. Beyond Germany, the story of Valkyrie resonated deeply. In a century scarred by dictatorships, revolutions, and ideologies, the idea that one could resist from within became a symbol of hope. In Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, dissidents cited Valkyrie as proof that even in totalitarian systems, individuals could choose differently. In South Africa, during apartheid, educators taught it as a lesson in moral courage. And in the modern world, where authoritarianism still rises in new forms, the question Valkyrie raised, when does duty end and conscience begin, remains painfully relevant. For historians, Operation Valkyrie is a turning point, the moment when moral resistance entered the story of World War II not as a footnote, but as a central truth. Because war is not only fought with weapons, it is fought with choices. The men of Valkyrie lost their battle, but they won something greater. The power to remind future generations that conscience has a price and silence has a cost. Their story also changed how nations view obedience. After the war, during the Nuremberg trials, many Nazi officials defended themselves by saying they were only following orders. The world rejected that argument, partly because of Valkyrie. The existence of the German resistance proved that not everyone obeyed. That choice was possible. That morality did not end with fear. From that moral precedent came one of the most important principles of modern law, that individuals are responsible for their actions, even under orders. It became known as the Nuremberg Principle, and it remains the backbone of international human rights. In a sense, the legacy of Valkyrie lives within every courtroom that defends justice over power. And yet the story remains haunting, because for all their courage, the conspirators failed. Hitler lived, and millions more died before the war's end. For years, that shadow of failure hung over their memory. But as time passed, something shifted. Failure began to look like something else: sacrifice. Claus von Stauffenberg did not die believing he had failed. He died believing that one day his act would mean something, that future generations would know there had been Germans who stood for honor. That Germany's soul, though buried under fear and violence, had not been entirely lost. In that, he was right. The world remembers Operation Valkyrie not because it succeeded, but because it was attempted at all. Because in a moment of overwhelming darkness, a few men decided that their conscience was worth more than their lives. And perhaps that is the true victory. Not the fall of a tyrant, but the rise of moral courage. Not the end of a regime, but the proof that even in its heart, goodness refused to die. This was not a story of power. It was a story of conscience, of men who tried to give their country back its soul. History is not made only by those who win. Sometimes it is defined by those who refuse to surrender to what is wrong. The men of Operation Valkyrie did not live to see the world they tried to save, but their defiance did not die with them. It became an echo, one that still shapes how we think about power, duty, and conscience today. In the years after World War II, as nations rebuilt, the world began to ask itself questions that had no easy answers. How could a civilized society fall into such evil? How could so many follow orders that violated every law of humanity? And why did only a few, so very few, choose to resist? Those questions haunted generations. They led philosophers, generals, and ordinary citizens to re-examine the meaning of obedience. Because if blind loyalty could destroy a nation once, it could happen again. The story of Valkyrie became a warning carved into the conscience of democracy. It taught that evil does not demand belief, only silence. And silence, history learned, is the first form of complicity. In the new German army, the Bundeswehr, that lesson was written into its very foundation. Every soldier was taught about Valkyrie, not as a story of failure, but as a moral compass. The oath they took no longer swore allegiance to a person, but to the Constitution, to humanity, and to the rule of law. In their training, officers studied the July 20th plot as a case study in moral decision-making. The question was simple: what would you have done? That question spread far beyond Germany. In the United States, Britain, and other democracies, military ethics programs began referencing Valkyrie to illustrate the difference between duty and morality. Because every soldier at some point faces the same choice: to obey or to question, to follow command or to follow conscience. For leaders too, Valkyrie became a mirror, a reminder that authority without accountability leads to ruin, that loyalty, when divorced from truth, becomes tyranny, and that even the most powerful can fall when those beneath them stop believing. Psychologists studying obedience in the 1960s and 70s drew direct parallels to Nazi Germany and the failed coup. They discovered a troubling truth. Most people, when ordered by authority, will comply, even against their own morals. The famous Milgram experiments proved it. Participants, instructed by a scientist, delivered what they believed were painful electric shocks to others, simply because they were told to. Nearly 2/3 obeyed. It was a chilling reflection of how ordinary people become instruments of harm. But then, a few refused. Those who stopped the experiment, who questioned the order, they represented what the psychologists called the Stauffenberg minority, the people who would rather disobey than destroy. It became a powerful concept in the study of human behavior, that conscience is not the norm, but the exception. And yet, without those exceptions, humanity collapses. As the 20th century moved on, new regimes rose and fell, repeating the same patterns of fear and obedience. From military dictatorships in Latin America, to communist purges in Eastern Europe, to genocides in Asia and Africa, the question of Valkyrie returned again and again. When do you stop obeying? In South Africa, during the final years of apartheid, Nelson Mandela cited the German resistance in his writings, describing them as men who saw truth in the face of terror. In Poland, during the Solidarity movement of the 1980s, underground newspapers compared their struggle to Valkyrie, a rebellion not of armies, but of conscience. Even in modern Russia, a small memorial to the July 20th plot stands quietly in Moscow, a gesture of respect for those who dared to resist tyranny, even from within. The idea that one must act, even when the outcome is certain death, transcends time and place. It is the essence of moral courage, and Valkyrie gave that courage a face. The story also found a new voice in art and film. In 2008, a major motion picture revived the tale of Claus von Stauffenberg for audiences across the world. But beyond the cinema's dramatization, historians pointed out something deeper, that the story's power was not in the bomb, but in the choice. Because every age faces its own version of tyranny, not always in the form of dictators, sometimes in systems, in corruption, in lies that become normal. And every age needs its own Stauffenbergs, people willing to say no when everyone else stays quiet. The story also entered classrooms around the world as part of moral education. Teachers used it not to glorify assassination, but to teach the cost of moral inaction. Students debated questions that remain uncomfortably relevant. Would you risk your life to stop injustice? Would you turn against your leader if it meant saving others? Would you have the courage to stand alone? Valkyrie turned from history into philosophy. It became a moral parable, a guide for the modern conscience. And as societies grew more complex, more digital, more interconnected, more manipulated, its lesson only grew sharper. In today's world, power does not always wear a uniform. It hides behind screens, slogans, and systems. It rewards compliance and punishes dissent. But the lesson of Valkyrie still applies. That moral courage begins when you are willing to lose everything for what is right. Claus von Stauffenberg once said that a man's duty is to his conscience, not to his orders. Those words remain a quiet challenge to every generation, because history has shown that the greatest crimes are not committed by monsters, but by the obedient, and the smallest acts of resistance, the ones that seem futile, can echo across centuries. In 2019, the last surviving witness of the Valkyrie conspiracy, Bertolt Schenk von Stauffenberg, spoke publicly about his father's legacy. He said, "People think my father failed, but failure is only when you stop acting. He acted, And that's what matters. Those words captured what history had taken 70 years to understand. That success is not always the measure of worth. Sometimes the attempt itself, the decision to stand when everyone else kneels, becomes victory enough. In memorial halls across Germany, one sentence is engraved on the walls where the conspirators died. You did not bear the shame. You resisted. Those 7 words carry the weight of a nation's conscience. They remind the living that resistance is not betrayal when the thing you resist is wrong. That silence is the first step toward tyranny, and that one person's courage can change the moral direction of history, even if it doesn't change its outcome. Because the men of Valkyrie did not fail. They simply lived too early for their success. Time has buried the sound of the gunfire that ended their lives. The courtyard of the Bendler block is quiet now, a simple stone plaza surrounded by the walls that once echoed with orders, shouts, and death. Where once stood the conspirators in their final moments, there now stands a single bronze figure. It is not a man in uniform, not a soldier with a weapon. It is a man with his hands bound behind his back, head bowed, calm, defiant. It is the monument to Operation Valkyrie, the nameless symbol of the German resistance. It does not celebrate victory. It honors dignity, the dignity of those who knew they would die, but chose to act anyway. Visitors come in silence. Some are soldiers taking their oaths. Some are students holding flowers, and some are simply people who want to understand how such horror could have happened, and how anyone found the courage to stand against it. The guide tells them what happened here on July 21st, 1944, points to the spot where Claus von Stauffenberg fell. He explains that it was over in seconds. Then he says something that stays with every visitor. They died believing Germany could be better than its past. History often remembers the victors, the conquerors, the survivors. But Valkyrie reminds us that there is another kind of victory, the victory of conscience. It is not measured in land or power, but in integrity. It does not end wars, but it redeems humanity. Claus von Stauffenberg was not perfect. None of them were. They were products of their time, patriots trapped in a nightmare of their own making. But in the end, they chose to break free. They chose to see the truth and to act upon it, even when it was too late. That single choice changed the moral direction of a nation, because in 1944, when the world saw Germany as a machine of destruction, Valkyrie proved there were still human beings inside it, capable of guilt, compassion, and courage. The conspirators could not save their country, but they saved its conscience. And sometimes that is enough. Their legacy is not written in books alone. It lives in every soldier who questions an unlawful order, in every citizen who speaks against injustice, in every whistleblower who risks everything for the truth. Every time someone says, "No, I will not," the echo of Valkyrie returns. In our modern world, tyranny does not always march in boots. It whispers. It spreads through misinformation, through fear, through the comfort of indifference. It hides behind convenience and conformity. And the question that haunted those men in 1944 still haunts us now. What will you do when silence becomes complicity? Because resistance today does not always mean rebellion. Sometimes it means honesty in the face of lies. Sometimes it means empathy in the face of cruelty. Sometimes it means refusing to look away. That is the eternal lesson of Operation Valkyrie. It was never only about killing a dictator. It was about reclaiming humanity from the hands of obedience. In the years since the war, historians have called it many things: a failed coup, a moral uprising, a desperate act. But perhaps it was something simpler, a reminder that there is always a choice. Even in the darkest systems, even in the deepest fear, choice survives, and with it, hope. When Stauffenberg walked into Hitler's headquarters with that briefcase in his hand, he knew the odds. He knew the plan could fail. He knew he would die. But he did it anyway. Not because he thought he could win, but because he knew someone had to try. That single act, that moment of conscience, changed the course of moral history. It reminded the world that evil is not inevitable, that courage is not extinct, and that even one man, standing alone, can remind humanity of what it means to be human. In a speech delivered decades later, a German general said, "Every soldier should carry two things, his weapon and his conscience. If he ever loses the second, the first becomes a danger to everyone." That sentiment is the soul of Valkyrie, a warning and a promise, a warning that obedience without morality leads only to ruin, and a promise that moral courage, though rare, can never be entirely destroyed. The wolf's lair is a ruin now. Nature has reclaimed it. Vines cover the bunkers, trees grow through cracks in the concrete. Visitors walk quietly through what remains, touching the walls that once shook with an explosion that almost changed the world. It feels peaceful now, but beneath the silence, there's a strange gravity, as if the ground itself remembers. Somewhere between those ruins and the courtyard in Berlin, the story of Valkyrie still breathes. It lives in every reminder that the line between good and evil runs not between nations, but through every human heart. The men who acted on July 20th did not win the war, but they won something far more enduring, the right for their country to say, "We tried." And in that act of trying, of refusing to surrender their conscience, they gave future generations the courage to do the same. This was the unknown zone, where the past speaks to the present, and the truth hides in the silence between obedience and defiance. Because in the end, Operation Valkyrie was never just about killing a tyrant. It was about proving that even in a world of darkness, a single act of conscience can still light the way.